there's a reason why the progress that computers have made in chess is exponential. And that has a lot to do with this, enormous store of previous data, repetitive patterns, constrained rules, very clear information, all those sorts of things. And the grandmaster's advantage is often in their pattern recognition. And that's the case for a lot of specialized professionals. Things they do is pattern recognition. But I think in a lot of those so-called kind learning domains, they're more amenable to automation. And so what humans have to add to it is these broader strategies instead of this deeper specialization.
That's David Epstein, New York Times best-selling author of a brand new book called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. David's research has found that while specialists still have a place and are still needed in the business world, they have been overvalued in our society, whereas generalists, on the other hand, have been greatly undervalued. It is actually the generalists who are most likely going to triumph in the future of work. And this is the topic that we are focusing on in today's discussion. Why are generalists more successful leaders? How can you develop your range? When did the idea of specialization even start, and why? These are some of the questions that David answers in today's discussion, along with many others. You will also hear the backstory of how he came to write this new book, which is quite fascinating, very serendipitous, and not what you would expect. Tune in and enjoy.
Our natural inclination is to plateau at a level of sort of very good. And I think that's our natural inclination for sort of everything. We become competent in the work that we do. And we know, from psychology, that personality, openness to experience, your willingness to try new things tends to decline as you get older. And although you can reverse that by trying new things. And so we get in these ruts where we're just doing the same things we did, where it's like, if you go to the gym and lift the same weights the same number of times every day, you're not going to slide backward, but you're also not going to cause the kind of adaptation you need to get better.
This is Jacob Morgan, best-selling author, speaker, and futurist. Welcome to the Future of Work podcast, where every week I speak with C-level executives, business leaders, and authors to explore how the workplace is changing and what the future of work is going to look like. The goal of this show is to give you the insights, the ideas, and the inspiration to help future-proof your career and your organization. If you want to get access to more content, such as podcast transcriptions and information on working with me or having me keynote your next event, you can visit my website at thefutureorganization.com. If you want to take your education even further by getting access to courses that explore these themes in more depth, then check out futureofworkuniversity.com. Also, if you get a few seconds, please rate and review the podcast on iTunes or whatever your preferred channel is. It really helps the show, and I personally appreciate it, since the podcast does take quite a bit of effort to produce. In case you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or working with me, my email is jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Future of Work podcast. My guest today is David Epstein, and he is the New York Times best-selling author of a brand new book called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And he's also the best-selling author of The Sports Gene: Inside the Science of Extraordinary Athletic Performance. David, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So this book is a beast of a book. It's like 350 pages. I had a chance.
Hey, that's including like 30 pages of citations, so people don't actually have to read 350
pages. That is true. That's fair enough. But before we jump into the book and some of the cool things that you talked about in there, maybe you can give people a little bit of background information about yourself, and how did you even get involved with writing best-selling books about sports, about range? What were you doing before all this stuff?
Good question. And I have to give the disclaimer here that there's a sad component to this story. So, but I'm going to tell the story, which is that I was training to be a scientist in college, and I was a competitive runner, and a training partner of mine died at the end of a race. who was, one of the top ranked guys in his age group in the country. And I got very curious how such a thing could happen, and had his family eventually sign a waiver to allow me to gather up his medical records. And it turned out that he had a disease caused by a single genetic mutation that's misdiagnosed, almost always the cause when you hear of a young athlete dropping dead. And I decided that I wanted to write about sudden cardiac, merge my interest in sports and science, and write about sudden cardiac death in athletes. I went on to grad school in science, but it was getting very narrow, and I was thinking about doing something else. But I wanted to write about sudden cardiac death in athletes, and I wanted to do it for a popular audience. And so I decided I wanted to try to do that for Sports Illustrated. And through many zigs and zags, I ended up doing that at Sports Illustrated and then becoming the science writer at Sports Illustrated. And it was investigating that disease that first spurred my interest in genetics, which eventually led to the book, The Sports Gene. And it was actually something that came out of the sports gene that sort of led to Range. If you want me to keep going with the story.
No, please. Yeah, because I think I could see how maybe one led to the other, but the books are also quite different. I mean, one is very much about sports. So how did that lead to this one?
Yeah, there were sort of two things that converged for Range. The first was after the sports gene, I got invited to a conference about sports development, founded by the general manager of the Houston Rockets. And I was invited to debate Malcolm Gladwell. It's on YouTube, 10,000 Hours versus the Sports Gene. And as Malcolm would say, I devoted several pages to attacking his work. But basically, I was critiquing the research that went into the so-called 10,000 Hours rule. And this was the first time he and I met, and he's a very bright guy, and I didn't want to get demolished on stage. And so I tried to anticipate the things he was going to argue, and I figured, of course, he would have to argue for early specialization in sports as the best route to success. And so I looked at what the science had to say about that. And it turns out that in most sports, the typical pattern is that athletes who go on to become elite have what's called a sampling period, where they play a variety of sports. They gain these broad general skills. They learn about their interests and their talents, and they delay specializing until later than peers who plateau at lower levels. And so I brought that up in the debate, and it's kind of incompatible with early hyperspecialization being the thing of primary importance. And afterward, he sort of said, you kind of got me on that thing. You should write about that. And I filed it away in the back of my head, was not at all ready to write another book. And, maybe more than a year, almost 2 years later, I got involved with the Pat Tillman Foundation. I went to give a talk to the Pat Tillman Foundation, which gives scholarships to military veterans to aid their career changes, basically. And it was just a tiny group I was talking to, and I talked about this late specialization in sports, and then I added on just at the end a little bit about research in other fields. And they were so receptive to it because they're all changing careers and they all felt behind and were wondering if their previous experiences would have any use in their new work. And so it was like this overwhelming response I didn't expect. Former Navy SEALs saying like, "Oh, I feel desperately behind." Former Navy SEALs were in grad school at Harvard being like, "Oh, I've been told I'm so behind." And I was like, "Gosh." My conversation with Malcolm came back to my head, and I sort of said, maybe sports would serve as a good analogy for these other fields, and that there's a project that might be important to people to look into here. So sort of the coming together of that post-sports gene debate and this experience I had with those veterans that made me think about taking on this project.
That's very cool. So it's pretty serendipitous. You didn't actually have that idea, but through kind of these various encounters, that's where the idea for the book came from.
Correct. I think without either one of those things, without Malcolm sort of being open to that conversation and liking that idea, and without that interaction with the veterans, I think without both of those, I don't take on this project.
So is Malcolm collecting royalties?
He doesn't need my royalties.
And so how did that end? Are you and Malcolm still on speaking terms, or is that just kind of like?
Oh yeah. Oh, after that, the next day after the debate, he invited me. We're both kind of running geeks, basically, and he invited me to run with him, do an interval session the next day. So we did that, and then we became running buddies. And then we talked about, he's super open-minded. So then we would talk about this stuff on our own time, and we didn't necessarily agree about some things we agreed about and some things we didn't. But yeah, no, then we became much more friendly, and we were invited back to the same conference just in March of this year, and that's also on YouTube. And toward the end, he says, I've kind of changed my mind about some things now. I feel like I conflated two things. I conflated the idea that a lot of practice is important for developing expertise with the idea that in order to become good at X, you should start as early as possible in doing X and only X. And he said, I feel like I conflated those, and I only believe one of them, not the other now. So I think he sort of nuanced his view, and we get along great.
Very cool. Well, let's talk maybe very high level about the book, because there's a lot of stuff in there that I want to talk about. But from a very high level, and correct me if I'm wrong, the whole idea of the book is it is better to be a generalist than it is to be a specialist in something. That's kind of the general thesis, the idea of everything, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it even more broadly, because I mentioned several times, as the NPR review noted, I repeatedly give credit to dissenters, as they put it, because I think we also need specialists, clearly. But I think the argument is society is often overvalued specialists and undervalued generalists, basically. Okay. And increasingly so as the world becomes more specialized and people are pushed to specialize more and more.
Okay, that makes more sense. It's not that generalists are going to rule and specialists have no place. Specialists still do have a place, but maybe a little bit more favored toward the generalists if you're looking at, future success.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way that in range that Freeman Dyson, who was, an eminent physicist and mathematician and a great writer, styled it, where he gave this speech where he says, we need both birds and frogs. The frogs are down in the mud looking at the tiny details of things and getting deeper and deeper. The birds are up above and they can't see those details, but they can integrate knowledge across, a broad expanse and integrate different frogs with one another in some cases. And he said, we need both of those. We need them both. He was talking about science specifically. But he said, we need them both in order to have a healthy ecosystem. The problem is we're telling everyone to become a frog. And the more everyone's becoming a frog, the more we need and the more opportunities there are for those birds. So we should stop telling everyone to become a frog, or else we're going to have a real problem. And I kind of think about it the same way that he did in other domains.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's start super high level with what are specialists and what are or I should say, who are specialists and who are generalists. Maybe you can give an example of each.
Yeah, so this is in some ways a semantic issue, but let's try to take it in a specific place. So in parts of the book where I talk about technological innovation, this is actually defined. So it's actually defined in different ways depending on the area of research. So in technological innovation, some of the research will define specialists as essentially people who have spent all of their working life working in one or a very small number of different technological classes as classified by the U.S. Patent Office. There's about 450 different classes. Whereas the generalists would be people who spread their work across a much larger number of technological classes. And so there's actually a quantification of it in some of those areas. Or in some of the comic book research I talk about, it's based on the number of different genres that people have worked across and things like that. So it sort of depends on the domain that you're actually talking about. I think in the more qualitative sense, it's usually someone who's done quite a bit of zigzagging before they land on their eventual work, some of which was not directly climbing the ladder toward where they are now, basically. So I think there are both these, in areas of research, there are these very quantitative definitions depending on the research, and also this more qualitative, just how people think about it, as someone who has broader skills and experiences than they would have to occupy their position in the world, and then a lot of their peers have.
Would a specialist, for example, be somebody that has spent their entire career in, for example, sales? And maybe a generalist is somebody who was in sales and marketing and HR, they did customer service, they kind of moved around to different areas instead of just focusing on one?
For sure. And that reminds me of something related. Like, so LinkedIn recently did some research on members, about 500,000 members, looking at what are the best predictors of who becomes an executive. And one of the best predictors was the number of different job functions that someone has worked across within an industry. Each additional job function saved someone about 3 years en route to the C-suite. So those people, I think LinkedIn's chief economist, his main recommendation from this research was that if you want to be an executive, work across more job functions, because you get this holistic view where you may not have drilled into any one area of work. Well, you didn't, by definition, basically drill too deeply into one area of work, but you get this holistic view of how the industry works as a whole and how to integrate the different functions. And so that kind of research suggests to me that most executives are in many ways generalists, because they've had to occupy a lot of different roles in order to become these integrators.
It's interesting because so I'm working on a new book coming out at the end of this year on the future of leadership. And I interviewed 130 CEOs around the world. And I actually also worked with LinkedIn to survey 14,000 employees. And
Cool.
one of the things that I noticed from a lot of the CEOs I was interviewing is they talked about the importance of having a diversity of thought, having a global mindset, having different experiences. So I also saw that theme emerge quite a bit in what a lot of the CEOs were telling me is being not only crucial now, but even more crucial in the coming years. So it's good to see that kind of, it fits in with some of the stuff that you were working on as well.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point you make, that it becomes more crucial because the more, this might go against our intuition, but the more people have to specialize. And again, specialization in a lot of areas has been both necessary and beneficial. But the more that happens, the more those specialists are seeing one tiny portion of a complex system. And if there's nobody looking at the overall system, you can have some serious problems. I mean, we can go into examples of that, but I get into that in the economy, in medicine, in all these other areas in range. So we can talk about those specifically if you want, but that's the general idea.
Please share
okay.
some of those stories and examples. I mean, people love hearing those.
So for example, something that only very rarely happens to me happened in the reporting of this book, which was a financial regulator heard that I was working on a book about specialization and called me, right? Usually I'm the one, 99.5% of the time, I'm the one making the call, not someone's calling me. And he called because he said he wanted me to know that specialization played an important role in the recession. And he said, basically, we had bank regulators regulating banks and consumer regulators regulating consumers and so on. Everyone is specialized in what they were doing and in their regulation. And the provision of credit ran across the entire system. And nobody was looking at that. So each regulator optimizing their tiny portion of this world still managed to lead to incredibly problematic whole, because nobody was keeping their eye on the whole system. And that, by the way, happens to be one of the lessons of MIT business students who shot the beer distribution game. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but
I haven't, no.
It's this sort of classic game that they're taught where people play different roles in a beer distribution pipeline, essentially. And long story short, and you can see examples of it on YouTube. Long story short, what it shows is that if each person in the chain, the distribution train, optimizes their own part of the chain, you still end up with all these backlog problems. Sometimes you're overproducing, sometimes you're underproducing. And even when the people are allowed to talk to the next step in the chain, they still develop those problems. And the way to defeat it is to have one person who is not occupying any step in the chain and is just looking at all of the other steps and helping coordinate them. So it's kind of, I think, similar. And in medicine, again, where specialization has been both necessary and beneficial, we've ended up with some problems where specialists become so specialized that they are only looking at what's called surrogate markers, which means they're looking at some part of the body that is a stand-in for the outcomes you really care about. It's a stand-in for the whole organism. So they will do something like, say, a cardiologist who specializes just in cardiac valves, just the floppy doors that open and close to let blood in and out of the heart. If someone has a problem, they'll do something with the cardiac valve. But the real point is to have fewer people dying from heart attack and stroke. But in many cases, someone will work on one of those surrogate markers like a cardiac valve or something, and you'll have people dying at the exact same rate just with a different cardiac valve. Or you'll have people dying of heart attack and stroke at the exact same rates just with lower blood pressure numbers. And it's becoming increasingly clear, I think, in the industry that looking at these surrogate markers and assuming that they represent the outcomes that we really want has been a big mistake. And a lot of the things that we've been doing might change those surrogate markers, but do nothing about the broader outcomes that we actually care about.
It kind of reminds me, I'm going to butcher this quote. You'll probably correct me. Isn't it like there's a quote that says, if you think like a hammer, everything you see is a nail, sort of thing?
Totally. I mean, and that I actually use that expression in range because in mentioning certain procedures that some doctors have gotten so attached to. So one that's common is cardiac stenting. So this is where you put basically a tube into an artery that's narrowed and pry it open, essentially. And if you're having a heart attack, like, this can save lives, but it's also used for people who have stable coronary artery disease, basically stable chest pain. And there's numerous randomized controlled trials that show it is not superior to like non-invasive forms of treatment for that, and that like 2% of people will have very serious side effects or die. And so some of this stuff like that, where specialists continue to use it, like not to believe the research and instead to believe their intuition and their personal experience, even though the reason we have research is because you can't just trust your intuition. And so there are these studies that I cite that show that if you have certain heart problems, you're less likely to die if you are checked into a hospital on the dates of a national cardiology conference when the cardiologists who do the most procedures are away, because you're less likely to get a procedure that was probably unnecessary and might kill you. And so the cardiologist who wrote the scientific journal editorial about that said, you know, me and my colleagues would always joke that the best place to have a heart problem is one of our conferences. And this study really turns that on its head and is a sign that there are a lot of things that specialists are doing that they are very good at doing, but they are doing them even when they shouldn't.
Well, I'm never going to go to a doctor again. Thank you.
That's basically the lesson I was trying to get through. No, of course not.
So when you talked about specialists and generalists, and this kind of popped into my mind, I don't know if this sort of fits into that. I was thinking a lot about this idea of strong ties and weak ties. Mm-hmm. So it kind of reminded me of that, where essentially we're very obsessed with the strong ties, but it's the weak ties that actually can be most beneficial in your life. And I kind of thought of that analogy when you were talking about specialists and generalists, where so many people focus just on these strong ties. But the reality is that for business relationships, for growth, for learning new things, it's actually the weak ties that are more important. So I'm not sure if you would agree that there's kind of an analogy or a similarity there, but that's kind of what popped into my mind.
Oh, no, I do that. And I think that strength of weak ties research is really fascinating. And I think it really dovetails particularly with the work of a woman in range, a professor at the London Business School named Herminia Ibarra. And
she's been a podcast guest. Yeah.
Oh, I've like found some of her work cathartic, obviously, because I've had like a zigzagging career also. But I loved her work. She gave one of the quotes that stuck in my own head as I think about my own career, which is, we learn who we are in practice, not in theory. And what she means basically is that we're not that good at just introspecting and understanding our talents and interests. We actually have to do stuff and then reflect on it. And that's how we learn about our talents and interests. So she says, act and then think, don't think and then act. And in her work, where she's documented people's, you know, as you may well know, depending on what part of her work you focused on, people who were transitioning in their careers would often start with someone on the fringe of their network, or someone they met at a dinner party, or some like connection they weren't even looking for would give them an idea to try something new. And then they would sort of dip their toe in, and then a little bit more and a little bit more. And eventually it'd get to the point where they're thinking about making a full transition, and their friends will say like, just keep it as a hobby. You don't want to get behind. And they get to the point where they feel they really have to change because they have this new thing they want to do. But it always starts with this, you know, it doesn't start with the people they already know, right? Because they already know that world. So it starts with these weaker ties where they somehow get kind of a keyhole view into something new. And that's how this change of identity begins.
Yep. I think we talked about that a little bit when I interviewed her. I actually spoke with her, maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, when her book, what was it? Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader came out. So yeah, I mean, she's done some really, really great work. This trend of specialization, have you looked at how far back this is traced to? So when did this idea of specialization start?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because in some ways it's context dependent, right? Like, you know, the sort of modern era of it, I would say, is basically, you think of things that came out of the Industrial Revolution. So, and Taylorism, you know, the idea of efficiency management and those sorts of things. And you know, if you go back through periods in history, there are like times of more and less specialization, but I'm thinking about it much more in a modern sense. And I think some of that made sense. Some of the science of management efficiency, because as industry grew, people were facing pretty repetitive challenges, or what the psychologist Robin Hogarth calls kind learning environments, where you're doing the same thing over and over. The feedback is very clear. Next steps are clear. All the information's available, and the feedback's always accurate, and so on. And patterns repeat. And so that made a lot of sense for industry. And I think it also influenced things like education because that was preparing workers for that type of work and so on. And it totally made sense. But I think in the knowledge economy, people aren't facing those repetitive challenges the same way, and they're having to reinvent themselves over their career. And if you actually look, some of the patent research I cite in Range suggests that these people who are broader, who spread their work across a larger number of technology classes, it's actually been kind of since like the late 80s that their influence has ballooned. So it's much more seems to be a function of the knowledge economy where specialist information is disseminated really quickly and thoroughly, and there's more opportunities to kind of recombine that knowledge for people who have a broader view. So I think it's sort of the modern version of it came out of Taylorism and the Industrial Revolution, which permeated sort of everything about work for a while.
Would you say that technology is helping push this? Because, I mean, technology makes it easier to pretty much learn anything that you want, get access to people, build networks, and it's really, really pushing this knowledge economy. Is that kind of a big shift that's forcing us to move from just being specialists to thinking more like generalists, or are there some other kind of trends that are making this happen?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think exactly, because again, the researcher who did that patent research suggested it's because of communication technology there's so much information that's so quickly and widely disseminated now that it makes there's many more opportunities to recombine knowledge in new ways rather than just pushing like a narrow frontier forward, which we still need. It's just his argument was there's a lot fewer opportunities for that compared to how many opportunities there are for recombining knowledge. And so I think that's definitely true. And I also think, so I use chess as an example in Range, where,
by the way, I have to say, I'm so the first 50 pages of your book where you talk about chess, for people that are listening to the podcast, they already know that I'm like a chess nut. But like I take lessons with a grandmaster. I follow the games. So when you started talking about chess, I was like, oh my God, I'm going to love this book. And then you mentioned StarCraft, which is like my childhood computer game. So you were speaking to me within the first couple pages of the book. Sorry, not to throw you off.
No, that's great. And so I mean, I love those things too. But so basically chess, which is great, there's a reason why it is why the progress that computers have made in chess is exponential. And that has a lot to do with this, enormous store of previous data, repetitive patterns, constrained rules, very clear information, all those sorts of things. And the grandmaster's advantage is often in their pattern recognition. And that's the case for a lot of specialized professionals and things they do. It's pattern recognition. But I think in a lot of those so-called kind learning domains, they're more amenable to automation. And so what humans have to add to it is these broader strategies instead of this deeper specialization. So in chess, like I talk about the centaurs, right, where Garry Kasparov has this, when he loses to Deep Blue, he sort of recognizes Moravec's paradox, or this idea that humans and computers have opposite strengths and weaknesses. And he says, okay, the computer destroys him at tactics, and patterns essentially, but he doesn't think the computer's as good at strategy, the sort of bigger picture, how to manage the many little battles to win the war. And so through a series of steps, he promotes these freestyle chess tournaments where computers can play alone, humans can play alone, humans can play with computers however you want. And the winners of this tournament are neither grandmasters nor supercomputers, nor grandmasters with supercomputers, but a pair of amateur chess players with a few laptops. And what Kasparov concludes is that the skills that centaurs use are different than what traditional chess grandmasters use. They are better at coaching the machines. They understand something about computers. They understand something about chess, and they can process this sort of streaming information and coach the computers. And so it totally changed the types of skills. So Kasparov all of a sudden was no longer the best as soon as you were allowed to use computers to supplement your skill. And I think that's similar to what we're seeing in a lot of fields where as interesting as gaming, AI that can beat games is, I think, more interesting. And Julian Togelius, who studies AI and gaming at NYU, was saying more interesting is that we're developing programs that take a lot of the specialized coding knowledge and can do that, so you can just be more of a creator and it'll help you create what you want to create. And so just how I think chess computers allowed some of these people who played freestyle chess to kind of outsource the years of experience or pattern recognition and focus on these sort of broader skills without the deep experience, I think we'll see that in a lot of other fields, and already are starting to, where we can automate the things that are often the product of years of deep experience and sort of focus on these higher level things. You already see that in things like building a website, right? You used to have to really know like HTML or whatever. Now you don't need to know anything. You'd be better off having good aesthetic taste than knowing like a coding language.
Yeah, you can just download themes, change some colors, and you're done.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've seen this. James Besson writes about this in a lot of industries where, and to use a quick example, so when the ATM was created, the thought was that it would put all bank tellers out of business. And in fact, what happened as there became more ATMs, there became more bank tellers because ATMs made each bank branch cheaper. So banks opened more branches, and each branch had fewer tellers, but they had many more branches, so more tellers overall. But it completely changed the job from one of repetitive cash transactions to one where the teller was actually like a marketing person, a customer service person, this much broader mix of skills, because the sort of technical repetitive stuff was outsourced to the ATM. And he uses that as an example and cites a lot of other examples where the jobs are changed in a way where the human skill mix becomes a little more amorphous and broader and involves these so-called softer skills. And so I think that's kind of a good symbol too.
I actually had so David Fairhurst is the chief people officer of McDonald's, and he was a guest, I think it was last year. And I was asking him about this because, as you probably have noticed, McDonald's is putting in a lot of kiosks in their stores. And a lot of people were saying that these employees, because McDonald's is one of the world's largest employers, and everybody was saying that McDonald's is going to let go of all of these employees, and it's just going to be kiosks everywhere. And similarly, when I interviewed David, he said that not only are they not decreasing the headcount, in some stores they're increasing the headcount. And what they're doing is they're shifting the McDonald's model to be more of an experience chain, where they're going to bring you your food, ask you how your day is going, focus more on that kind of human interaction and relationship, and use the technology piece for the mundane stuff that you don't need a human for, right? Just pick your burger, pick the soft drink that you want, and you're done.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No. So I thought it was very interesting to see that same thing. And Evian, the water bottling company, noticed that. Accenture, I think they automated 17,000 jobs who were kind of number crunchers, and they taught those employees to be more like strategic advisors. So I think we're seeing this in a lot of different areas. Yeah,
I mean, and Besson has a bunch of really neat examples where the prophecy was that these jobs would disappear, and in fact they don't. They change very dramatically to this sort of like broader skill set. And that's not to say that there isn't, damage and that people lose jobs and those sorts of things. But often the technology creates new jobs. They're just different jobs that require a broader mix of skills and more kind of lifelong learning, basically, because the change becomes a constant. So I think that's a great example that you raised, basically. And one of the other ones I liked, I spent some time with the UPS data analytics, data science team. And it's not intuitive that might be such an interesting company, but think about the rise of e-commerce. And what's happened is their drivers used to have to hit, a couple dozen spots a day. But now that individual homes order many more packages, their drivers have to hit like 120 spots a day. And there are more different combinations of connecting 120 dots than there are atoms in the universe. So their data science project was to come up with a customized navigation tool that would help their drivers do this efficiently. And a couple interesting things happened. First of all, they had the whole data science team had to work as drivers so they could understand like where the cinches in the hose were, basically, for making change, which I thought was very cool and kind of in line with the range thesis. But also it changed a lot of the skills they needed from their drivers, because some of the navigation stuff could now be outsourced, but you were dealing with many more customers and having to sort of prioritize things. So the customer service aspect and this higher level decision making became much more important. And it also allowed them to bring in, like during a surge, during the holidays, a lot more workers, even if they didn't have experience with the navigation aspect, because that was no longer the most important skill. So I thought that was kind of a neat example too.
Oh, the whole like logistics, delivering package. I mean, that stuff is just fascinating. Like with the amount of packages that are getting ordered, like how all that works is just kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah. Totally.
So it's really, really an interesting space to look at. So you mentioned this, so I have to ask you about this, and you kind of touched on a little bit. But when you think about the impact of AI and technology on the future of work and jobs, it sounds like you are more of an optimist. Although I'm sure you've read many of the articles that are citing kind of the doom and gloom scenarios and everyone's going to be out of a job. So where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing to take on too, because there are two things. One, the change does cause disruption and dislocation, and there are often, I think, winners and losers in those things, and sometimes. And let's say some of that technology creates an enormous number of new jobs, but some of those jobs are in other countries. Like that can, even if it's creating an enormous number of new jobs, that can still be a problem for an individual country that's losing those jobs, right? And so I'm an optimist in the sense that I think Beston's argument is sound, that technology tends to create more jobs and free us up to do the more uniquely the aspects of jobs that humans are uniquely good at. That said, what I'm more concerned about is that even if it is creating more jobs, the social effect that has during the disruption, or when those jobs are moving places and moving skills, and how does that affect society as a whole? So my concern isn't about just the disappearance of jobs in terms of net number, but about just the repercussions of dislocation. I think we have to think a lot harder about that, even while I believe that technology, creates a lot of new jobs.
Yeah, fair enough. And even if the new jobs that get created are even jobs that we want to have.
Yeah, no, exactly. But it's, the problem is I mean, I think one of the other arguments Besson makes is that the thing is, this requires people to learn and relearn a lot more than they had to do in the past, because the jobs change quickly and they can't just sort of, settle into one. They can specialize, but they're going to have to do it repeatedly. So they can't just expect to have the same job their whole career anymore. And so really the reason he was doing his work is to say, we need to be ready for this to help people become these more sort of lifelong learners and move across job functions. Otherwise, we're going to have some serious social problems.
I'm sure a lot of people listening to you now have read Malcolm Gladwell's book, and they have thought about the 10,000 hour rule. A lot of people have become quite obsessed with it. So what you wrote about, I guess, I don't want to say kind of disproves everything, but there are some contradictions between this idea of being a generalist versus kind of that specialization 10,000 hour rule. So for people listening to this that were so obsessed with that book and with 10,000 hours, and they, were trying really hard to focus on those 10,000 hours, what do you say to them? Is that just kind of all useless now?
No. If the idea they take away from it is that practice is important, then I'm all on board with that. I think from the standpoint of people who study skill acquisition, that is uncontroversial, the idea that practice is important. But the 10,000 hour rule, it comes specifically from this study of 30 violinists who were like so highly pre-screened they were already in a world famous music academy, and 10,000 hours was the average hours of deliberate practice for the best 10 of them. And some of them had a bunch more and some of them had a bunch less, and 10,000 was the average, right? So it's like Fernand Gobet, who was I think the second ranked chess player in Switzerland and is now a scientist. He did a study with a colleague looking at how long it took people to become in international master status in chess. And I think the range was like 3,000 hours to some people were at 25,000 hours and they still hadn't made it. And the average was 11,053 hours. But what good does an 11,053 hour rule tell you? If what you really want to know is the range, because by taking that average, it squashes human variation. So first of all, the 10,000 hour rule, because that paper only had an average of what was actually a large range and did not include any measures of variance, which is very unusual, it didn't really tell the story of human variation. And so that's a first problem with it. The other one is it isn't really a rule, and there isn't a 10,000 hours rule thing. Like if you look at, athletes, most of them make it to the pros in between 4,000 and 6,000 hours. And if you look at other domains, it's totally different. So it's really domain dependent. But if the idea people are taking away from it is that practice is important, that's great. If the idea they're taking away from it is that they should pick a specialty and just do their 10,000 hours in that. That I think is bad, because I think there's a lot of research that shows that it's really important to maximize what economists call match quality, which is the degree of fit between your interests, your abilities, and the work that you do. And as Herminia Ibarra would tell you, you can't do that without experimenting in some things. And when you get better match quality, not only do you work harder, right? This phrase, once you get fit, it'll look like grit, but your growth rate is much higher because you're playing to your strengths and interests. And so I think it's not bad to put in that practice, but I think you need a period of experimentation first, just like athletes, that sampling period, so you can work toward optimizing your match quality, because that is a really important determinant of performance that has nothing to do with just putting in 10,000 hours.
The phrase kind of that I used to describe this concept in the past was sort of thinking like a taste tester. Like if you go into an ice cream shop and you don't know what flavor you want, you typically take a bunch of samples and then see what you like and what you don't like. And so that's kind of what I think of when I think of this idea of being a generalist. Instead of just going in there and getting vanilla each time, you sample different things and see what you like.
Exactly. That's a lot of the people I highlight in the book did not set out like, as if they were in Florence in the Renaissance saying, I'm going to be a Renaissance person. It was that they would try something and be like, you know what, that doesn't fit the way I hoped. And they zig and zag, and they end up in a place where they have this broader mix of skills. And sometimes they're competing on their own turf, which was sort of the case for me. Like when I decided I was for sure wanted to try to be a writer, I was living in a tent in the Arctic as a science grad student. Right. And when I leave that, I'm like, well, that was a waste. And then, fast forward some years later and I'm at Sports Illustrated, and suddenly my very ordinary science skills are totally unique and extraordinary. And so all these people are waiting in line to be like the 20th, NFL beat reporter or whatever. Meanwhile, I have this weird mix of skills. So I go from like temp fact checker to senior writer and just like bypassing everyone because I'm competing on ground that no one else is even on. And I think that was the case for a lot of these generalists, where it wasn't they were setting out to do that. It was that they zigged and zagged until they sort of created their own turf, their own sort of mix of unique skills.
A tent in the Arctic, huh?
Yeah. I was an
just kind of like just casually threw that in there.
Yeah. I have. It's really funny. I was changing jobs so fast that I have a paper in the Journal of Antarctic and Alpine Tundra or something, where my contact information is listed as at Sports Illustrated, which is probably a first for that journal.
Wow. Well, it sounds like you had a bunch of different and unique experiences. What about for people listening to this podcast now? Maybe they're specialists, maybe they're generalists. Do you have advice for business professionals? I mean, what if they're already so far down their career? They're in their 40s, their 50s, their 60s. They're kind of like, you know what? It's too late to change. It's too late to think differently. Is that really true, or is this something that you can apply at any point in your career?
No, let's start with 40s, okay? Because just like we all know the Tiger Woods development story and don't know that the science actually says that usually athletes have a sampling period, we all know that the Mark Zuckerberg story, where at age 22 he said young people are just smarter, right? I was actually just at an event, a Motley Fool event, which I'm sure some of your listeners know Motley Fool.
I know Motley Fool, yeah.
And there was a poll put up on a screen where the audience could vote on their cell phone, and the poll asked, "What do you think is the average age of a founder of a breakout startup, not when it becomes a breakout, but on the day of founding? 25, 35, 45, 55. And the answers were something like 75% said age 25. And in fact, really recent research from MIT, Northwestern, and the Census Bureau show that the answer is about 45 and a half. And that is, again, on the day of founding, not when it becomes a breakout. So And that 50-year-olds were much more likely to found a breakout startup than were 30-year-olds. And 30-year-olds were more likely than 20-year-olds. And so I think we sort of fall prey to the availability heuristic, Kahneman's availability heuristic, where we fixate on these dramatic stories of youth that are dramatic because of how young the people are. But it turns out they aren't the norm at all. And that the most successful entrepreneurs are middle-aged. And obviously they're starting something new in middle age, and they needed some experiences maybe to figure out what they should try to do. And so I think we should focus on what the science says is the norm, not on these few cases that are dramatic, but that don't represent a typical path, even if those people did have success at a young age.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. I think you did actually a TV interview where you were talking about that as well. So I was quite surprised to see that was the age as well, because so many people talk about the Snapchats, the Instagrams, the Facebooks, where some of these people were in their teens and early 20s. Right. It's crazy.
And those are specifically like companies where we know the names a lot, because those are companies that are also catering to young people, basically, right? And a lot of companies that do a lot of important things aren't as sort of publicly sexy as some of those things, but are no less important.
Yep, very true. So let's say you're a specialist now. Are you just kind of like screwed for the future? Or like, because I'm sure a lot of people listening to this, they've been in the same kind of field or career or job for most of their lives. Some of them probably not very happy with what they're doing. And maybe some of them are. But does it mean that you're kind of just like, you're just going to carry along with whatever you've been doing? Or do you just kind of stop and quit and pivot?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think... Well, and first of all, the Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that the late baby boomers, starting with about the very last baby boomers, they've averaged from age 18 to 48 about 12 jobs. And so I think this idea of the itinerant millennial who's having all these different jobs is actually just the continuation of a knowledge economy trend that really started with the very last of the baby boomers. And so I think people do tend to have some different jobs over the course of their life now. But you can always make changes. So the last chapter of Range, I talk about people who are quite specialized scientists and show even within that how some of these scientists who instead of going deeper decide to broaden themselves and how that becomes their source of power essentially. So I think even if you want to stay in what you're doing, the way we work is we gravitate toward our own competencies and then we get stuck on a plateau. So I want to give you an analogy. When I was doing my last book, I was reading scientific literature about speed typing. Okay, this sounds really stupid, but bear with me on this.
It sounds very exciting. Please continue.
Oh, okay.
Speed typing.
And basically, the lesson I took from it is when we're all learning to type, we learn to get pretty fast, and then we plateau at a good level or very good. But we can get like twice as fast, but it requires you to take a metronome and tick it up a little bit and type at that speed, no matter how many mistakes you make. Just you have to make that speed. And then a couple of days later, you tick it up a little bit again, and you can like double your speed basically if you want to do this. But our natural inclination is to plateau at a level of sort of very good. And I think that's our natural inclination for sort of everything. We become competent in the work that we do. And we know, from psychology that personality, openness to experience, your willingness to try new things tends to decline as you get older. And although you can reverse that by trying new things. And so we get in these ruts where we're just doing the same things we did, where it's like, if you go to the gym and lift the same weights the same number of times every day, you're not going to slide backward, but you're also not going to cause the kind of adaptation you need to get better. And so when I said we get in these ruts, actually I was talking to the economist Russ Roberts, and he said it's not a rut, it's a hammock because it's so comfortable that we don't want to get out. And so I think we have to proactively try to broaden ourselves and run some of those little personal experiments that Hermione Ibarra talks about, right? Where you don't have to stop on a dime and change your job. You can dip a toe in various ways. Go to some event or listen to something that you don't know anything about. Like expand your personal search function. Because again, it's those weak ties, right? The things that are outside of your immediate view where you might find these new interests and opportunities. And so, based on her work, I started keeping what I call a book of experiments, where just like when I was a science grad student, but here I say, here's something I think I'm interested in, here's some skill I have or would like to develop. What's a way for me to try to get some insight into that? And then I'll try something and reflect on it and go forward. So I don't think we have to think about taking flying leaps all the time. But for me, I am like at all times basically running little experiments to keep trying to triangulate what types of projects and work fit me. And I'm just doing that all the time, and I'm sure I will for the rest of my life.
Can you share any examples of the types of experiments you're talking about?
Yeah, so when I got stuck with the organization of this book, because structure is the part where I really get stuck, I decided just to try to get off that plateau. I was like, what can I do? Okay, took an online fiction writing course. So that's a different kind of writing. So suddenly, and it was amazing. Suddenly I have this feeling of being a beginner again. Nothing I've done matters. And some of the exercises you had to do were write with all dialogue or no dialogue. And after the no dialogue exercise, I realized I went back through the manuscript of Range and started stripping out all these quotes because I realized I'd been unconsciously relying on quotes in a lazy way to do explanation that I should be doing instead. And I hadn't even thought about it until I was made to do that exercise. So I went through and stripped those things out. And so I'll try little things like that. Or I do some volunteering and and when I do volunteering, it makes me feel good. But there's also an aspect of it where if I'm going to do it, I also want to learn some stuff, whether that's making my network better or learning some new skills. Like I also want stuff out of it. Yes. But so I spread those efforts thinly across a number of organizations and then sort of came back and said, well, which of these do I think I was able to contribute the most and learn the most? And it was sort of two particular organizations. So then I just focused my efforts on those ones only. And so I'm always like doing experiments like that kind of thing.
What is it about generalists? Because we talked about this idea that generalists are maybe going to triumph in this new kind of a world. But why? What is it about generalists versus specialists that allows them to either become more successful or grow or to become leaders in organizations? Why generalists?
Yeah, two reasons. One, because as the specialists, who again are very important, become more specialized, the holistic view of the context that they work in recedes from their view. The more specialized they become, and we need them to do that, the less they're able to see to integrate information across domains. So Arturo Casadevall, this scientist who's trying to despecialize the education of scientists, he's probably the most prominent immunologist in the world, maybe. I talk about in the last chapter. He says we have people, we now have all these people walking around with all the knowledge of humanity on their phone and no idea how to integrate it. He said, we've created a system of parallel trenches where everyone's down in their own trench and very rarely standing up to look over in the next trench, even though that's often where their answer is. And so I think there are the specialists become more specialized, so they sort of lose that holistic view. Secondly, with communication technology has led to many more opportunities for generalists because there's so much information available that recombining information in new ways, there are many more opportunities to do that than there are to just create new knowledge. So when I was thinking about getting off the science track, it was asking myself, am I the type of person who wants to learn one thing new to the world or much shorter spans of time learning things new to me and sharing them? And I was definitely the latter. And then it turns out in doing that, you can combine things in a way that I never would have seen if I were going down this much more specialized track. And lastly, they are less fragile to change. There's this classic research finding that can be summarized as breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. And what that means, transfer is the term psychologists use basically to mean the ability to apply skills and knowledge to situations you haven't seen before. So not something repetitive, but to some new situation. And how broad your training is predicts how well you're able to do that. So there are two types of knowledge you can gain in training: using procedures knowledge, which is where you learn how to do a procedure over and over and over, or making connections knowledge, where you learn how to connect concepts in a way where you're learning to match strategies to types of problems as opposed to just executing procedures. And that's the type of knowledge that you can bring to bear on problems that you haven't seen before. And in a rapidly changing work world where we all need to do that, it's the people with this broader training that will have the more flexible knowledge that they can apply to new challenges.
It makes sense because you can basically adapt, as you mentioned, whereas if you're very specialized and something changes, you're kind of like, oh my goodness, what do I do? And I suppose we saw this like in the finance space, right? I mean, everybody was so specialized just looking at stocks and doing analysis that when a lot of the AI and the bots and algorithms came, many of those people had a hard time pivoting careers and doing something else because they were just so specialized in that one area. But I think a lot of those people, I always like to think of it as paying attention to the tangential, like looking at things that are related to what you focus on, but a little bit outside the scope. Yeah. So in the case of finance, for example, you could easily pivot to data science or to people analytics and use some of those same skills. But if you don't have that mindset, you're just kind of like, oh man, what am I going to do the rest of my life? So I think that concept makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And again, I think we need specialists, but but boy, you better be like really at the top of a specialization as things are changing, if that's going to be like a comfy spot, I think we just, as one of this guy who won Innovator of the Year from R&D Magazine and started doing research on innovators, and I talk about some of his work in range, as he says, basically specialists are really important. We just need fewer of them and we need like more integrators who are integrating the knowledge that they're creating because it's disseminated so widely and quickly.
Can you be both? Because there has been this concept of T-shaped people, T-shaped leaders, where you can really be specific at something, but you can also span across a couple different areas. Does that work at all?
I think so. And this comes up in that same chapter I was just talking about. T-shaped, not only T-shaped people, but pie-shaped people who dive in and out of areas of specialty. And in fact, in that research on innovators, again, classifying people's degree of specialization based on the number of different domains they've worked across. The generalists and the specialists. So the generalists were people who just were always working in different technological domains. The specialists drilled down into one or a small number. And both of those types of inventors made contributions. There were two more types. There were basically the dilettantes who weren't that broad or that deep, and they really didn't make contributions, basically. And then there were the polymaths who started with this, either started with an area of depth and branched out from that, or started broad and picked an area of depth later. And they made the biggest contributions. So they were sort of, what you might call the T-shaped or pie-shaped inventors, where in one way or another they had developed an area of depth, but as their careers went on, they often, instead of going more depth, decided to go more breadth. And those things working in conjunction really made them the biggest contributors. So I absolutely think so.
How do you develop range? So for people that are listening to this that are thinking, okay, maybe I should start to think about how I can become a generalist, what advice do you have for them? Where can you start?
Well, Arturo Casadevall, who again I think is one of those people, he says he tells his people to read something outside of their field every day and without being too careful to pick it. So I think that's one thing you can do. My preference is sort of to follow the Herminie Ibarra advice, and I keep this book of experiments and think about something you'd like to learn and force yourself to do something that's outside of your norm. And also, I would say, if you're at a larger organization, like I learned so much by interviewing, right? One of the reasons I think sometimes, one of the reasons The Sports Gene, my first book, was successful is because all of these specialists who were doing work that bore on the same question, right? It was all relevant to this question I was interested in of nature and nurture in sports. And yet they were so unfamiliar with what one another were doing that it was just sitting there for me to put a picture together, right? So their specialization left me an opportunity, and I think that's often the case, and that we don't like interview our colleagues enough to learn what they do, so that we can integrate our functions and learn how other people work, and I think that's a mistake. And Arturo talks about this in, now everybody takes lunch back to their desk and there's not that mingling time.
Yeah, it's crazy. Or you're in front of your phone or computer.
Or Bill Gore, who founded the company that created Gore-Tex. He founded the company based on his observation that organizations did their most creative work during times of crisis because the disciplinary boundaries flew out the window. And everyone started just scrambling and talking to each other. And he liked to say real work happens in the carpool. And what I think he's essentially saying is because that's where you interact with people who are outside of your silo at work. So I think people should interview their coworkers, find out what they do, how you can help them and how they can help you. And I don't think we do that enough. And I think that would be an easy thing to do. So I think that's it.
Fairly easy. And I think it's LinkedIn that does this, or maybe it was another company. Maybe it was FreshBooks. But I've heard of companies that either give $5 for their employees to take out somebody for coffee, or I think it was FreshBooks that puts their employees on blind dates. And when I say blind dates, I don't mean romantic dates, but they just pair employees randomly up together to go for lunch to learn about each other, what they're working on, how they might be able to work together. So companies are trying to introduce some of these concepts as well, which I think is also great. Last thing I wanted to ask you before we wrap up, which I think is an important theme, is quitting. And so you talked about this in your book, this idea that we have this mantra that quitters never win. But that's not really true, is it?
Yeah, no. And so I like the Stephen Levitt, the Freakonomics economist, I guess, as a lot of people would know him, and did some leveraged his substantial following to do a study that in some ways bore on quitting, where people would flip a digital coin to decide whether they would go through with some life choice. And so a lot of those were, should they get a tattoo? Should they have a kid? Whatever. But the most common question was, should I quit my job? And he went through this detailed analysis to show there was actual causal effect of the coin flip on what people decided to do. And people who flipped, I think it was heads, and changed jobs were happier later on. And so the conclusion is basically, if you're thinking about quitting your job, you probably should. And I think that's backed up by other research that shows, again, we need to hunt for match quality. And what you should do is get a signal from the things you try, reflect on that, and then leave it and look for something better. So that's been one of the no quit, I think, concepts that's seeped into popular culture is grit. This psychological construct of grit, which rewards points for both perseverance and for, quote, consistency of interests. And the most famous grit study was done on U.S. military academy cadets trying to go through their 6-week rigorous orientation called Beast Barracks. And the grit survey was a better predictor of who would get through that than were these more traditional measures. Although most people get through it, most of them that are there get through it. And so, okay, they're gritty. But, life isn't a 6-week orientation and the people aren't pre-selected for a short-term goal. So when you zoom out and look at the longer picture, again, since the explosion of the knowledge economy, about half of those gritty West Point cadets have been leaving the Army on basically the day that they're allowed. And so a high-ranking Army official suggested defunding West Point because he said is, quote, an institution that taught its cadets to get out of the Army. And did the institution teach its cadets to get out of the Army? No, obviously not. But those people learn skills that they can transfer laterally in a knowledge economy. In their early 20s, they maybe learned something about themselves and developed new interests. And so they were leaving. And at first, the Army tried to throw money at them to get them to stay. And the people who were going to stay anyway took it. And the people who were going to leave anyway left. And that wasted $500 million of taxpayer money. And then the Army decided to take a different approach. They decided actually this is a matching problem. And they started something called talent-based branching, where instead of saying to these higher potential officers, here's your career track, go up or out, they said, here's a coach we're pairing you with. Here are a bunch of career tracks. Dabble in them a little. Your coach will help you reflect on whether this fits your talents and your interests. And then you sort of zigzag and we'll find you a better match. And that has been more successful for retention than just throwing money at people. And that is based on essentially quitting, except for, to make it, except for they reframed it, which I think is great. Instead of saying, oh, it's quitting things. No, it's trying things to find a better match. So I think we should sort of even drop the moniker of quitting. It's you're trying things so that you can triangulate your match quality.
I love it.
It's experimenting, not quitting.
Yeah, no. I love that mentality. Well, I just had a couple of rapid fire questions, just fun questions about you so people can get to know you a little bit better. Okay. So first one for you. Have you ever bombed a speech?
Yes. Yes. Oh, am I supposed to answer longer than that? Yes.
Well, now that you said yes, now I'm very curious if you're able to share anything about that speech.
I mean, the worst one ever was I got invited to this event in Texas, and basically it was at this outdoor amphitheater, and I was on a stage, and between me and the audience was like a canal that tourist boats were coming down, and the tour guides were like talking through a bullhorn. So that was a challenge to begin with. They were coming like right in front of me. Oh my God. Also none of the AV stuff worked, and so I had to try to give the talk like, it was bad. I didn't do a good job at sort of trying to give a talk that I had prepped with all these like cool visuals without any of the visuals. And so that was not fun at all.
Oh man. What are you most proud of?
Gosh, what am I most proud of? Ooh. Boy, that is a good question. I'm super proud of my wife. She started and runs an organization that's super mission driven. And I'm really proud of her. In terms of my own work, what am I the most proud of? Gosh, I mean, I did end up writing about sudden cardiac death in athletes for Sports Illustrated, and that was sort of my reason for getting into journalism in the first place. And so I'm proud I did that, but it also have very mixed feelings about it, I guess. But I guess I'm proud I did that.
What's the hardest business decision you've ever had to make?
To finish this book, Range, I had a job that I loved and realized that I could not get both things done at the same time. And so I left it to finish the book. That was a very difficult decision for me.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a tough choice. What is your favorite business or non-business book?
My favorite business or non-business book?
Yes.
So like just my favorite book? Oh God, I read a lot. This is tough. I mean, my favorite piece of something written is this play called The Pillow Man by the Irish playwright Martin McDonagh, who people probably know more as the director of like 3 Billboards and In Bruges and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite written things, but it's for the theater. Let's see. Gosh, there's so many things that I love. I mean, last summer, I was obsessed with War and Peace, which, by the way, I had no idea, but is essentially like a novel. It's like a refutation of the great man theory of history in the form of a novel. I don't know if most people know that. And so it has these historical essays where Tolstoy actually did historical research about Napoleon and argues that a lot of the tales about him can't be true, and that actually sort of a lot of leaders like him are effects, not causes of types of social movement, and that it's the confirmation bias or the survivor bias that historians exhibit for the documents that are left behind that causes them to kind of misinterpret history. And I thought it was both amazing as just a barn burner of a story once you can start remembering the Russian names, and I found his historical treatment super interesting. And after that, it led me to read this philosophy essay by Isaiah Berlin about foxes and hedgehogs who know one big thing and foxes who know many little things. And he uses these as characters in War and Peace. And those are the names that Philip Tetlock, the psychologist, then took to do his study of people who are good and bad at predicting political and economic trends in the world. So the hedgehogs turn out to be like that. Exactly. And his work ended up being part of my chapter 10 and really influencing my thinking. So in some ways, I had this line from War and Peace to this other scientific research that I was really thinking about. And so I really enjoyed that. You
just got a lot of these like serendipitous things happening. Your next book should be about that.
Man, I tell you, like I was an 800-meter runner in college, and like I view book writing as like writing the 800, torture in the middle. But at the end, if it went well, you're kind of like, well, maybe I'll do that again. Yeah. But boy, I'm gonna need some recovery time because I'm not trying to write another book right now.
Oh, I feel the pain. I'm towards the end of mine. I'm just hoping to finish it. The last 2 questions for you. Who's the best mentor you've ever had?
I think the best mentor I ever had was a guy named. I'm choosing between 2 now. Probably a guy named Kevin Coyne, who is a writer and teacher, and who, when I decided I was going to get out of science and get into writing, I sort of approached him because I thought I was going to jump right into book writing because I didn't know anything, right? And I told him, I have this idea of sudden cardiac death in athletes I really want to write about, and I sort of like requested if he would sort of mentor me for a project, having like no experience, not knowing what I'm doing, just sort of passionate pitch to him. And he did. And I learned a ton, and it helped me get into the business. It was just amazing. And he didn't have any reason to do that other than he, was maybe enjoyed my pitch and wanted to help.
Very last question for you. If you were doing a different career, what do you think you would have ended up doing?
Well, when I was a teenager, I was sure I was going to go to the Air Force Academy and be an astronaut, and I almost did go to the Air Force Academy. But it's a good question. I truly have no idea what I'm going to be when I grow up. However, I've learned in the reporting of this book that I think I would probably enjoy being a historian. There are a couple parts in the book where I go into history, and when I was like finding some documents in rare books archives, I was like so excited to see this stuff and thought it was so cool to like unearth some of these documents, some of which had I think I'm publishing some stuff from some of them for the first time, and the like excitement that I got from finding some of that stuff made me think like, maybe I would enjoy being a historian. So I have no idea when I'm gonna grow up, but through this project, it taught me that might be something that I would really like, and I hadn't thought about that before.
Very cool. Well, actually curious, how long did it take you to write the book?
I mean, the contract to me turning in the first manuscript, which was 15,000 words too long, was 2 years, and then it was, another matter of months cutting it down to the right length. But like the sports stuff, I was already thinking about that years back from my other book. So I was already thinking about that aspect of it well before I actually had a book contract.
Yeah. Well, where can people go to learn more about you, and where can they find your new book?
DavidEpstein.com, and that has links to all the places you can find it. And I like independent bookstores personally, but of course it's available on the big boys.
Yeah, it's available everywhere. Well, David, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with me and to talk about your new book. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, my guest has been David Epstein. Check out his new book called Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and I will see all of you next week.